Okay, everybody, welcome back to the podcast. I am joined by longtime guest at this point and dear friend, Dr. Kevin Vost, and we are going to discuss Stoicism, do a little introduction to Stoicism. And I think this is appropriate because, Kevin, on this channel, we've actually been reading a few letters of Seneca and some of the shorter ones, been reading them and commenting on them. But we haven't really done a sort of basics or foundational episode on Stoicism. And you are just the person to help us with this project. So thank you so much for being here.
Well, thanks for having me, Pat. I always enjoy talking about the ancient Stoics, or people who are far more ancient even than I am. But I think that what they've taught is just so valuable to us today. You know, it's really good stuff.
Yeah. So it's actually been a while since you've been on the podcast. So if you wouldn't mind, let's go back a little bit. Give us a little bit of your personal history, especially your sort of personal history with Stoic philosophy. And and what brought you to the point of writing this most recent book, which we'll talk about at some point, called Memorize the Stoics.
Okay, sure. To try to make a very long story very short, I was trained professionally as a psychologist back in the 1980s and 1990s. And during my undergraduate work, I really came to enjoy and get a lot of benefit from what's called cognitive therapy, cognitive psychotherapies, like the rational emotive therapy of Albert Ellis, an American psychologist, and the cognitive therapy of Aaron Beck, an American psychiatrist. Mm-hmm. And interestingly, both of these guys said that their fundamental core ideas to their therapies came from the ancient Stoics. And they singled out Epictetus, and one of his sayings that we can get into a little bit later. But anyway, so from the 80s and the 90s, I became aware of the Stoics when I found out how useful they were in the foundation of the cognitive and rational emotive therapies. I started reading the Stoics themselves. And the main Stoics that we know about, that we have most of their writings, are later Stoic writers like Epictetus and Seneca, who you'd mentioned, and the emperor Marcus Aurelius, Musonius Rufus, Epictetus' teacher, is another one. But they really had wonderful ideas there. So throughout a good part of my life, my adult life, I would always go back and try to read them. I was interested in religion as well as philosophy. And in my late teens, I was reading what I now consider some of the wrong philosophers. I became an atheist for about 25 years until I read the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas, a great medieval philosopher. But when I read Thomas and was kind of wowed how he answered all these questions of the atheists, I realized that one of the reasons I loved Thomas so much was that he incorporated that ancient wisdom that came from people like the Stoics, and from Plato, from Aristotle, from Socrates, and others. So particularly in his Summa Theologica, St. Thomas Aquinas references Seneca many times on many topics, on anger, on gratitude, on clemency. Even when he's talking about the theoretical concept of limbo, he manages to bring Seneca and Stoic ideas in there. So basically, though, since my early 20s, I've just been immersed in the writings of the Stoics. So they're very, very helpful. They're helpful to me in my personal life, because one of their main benefits is they can teach us how to be more tranquil, how to be more serene, how to accept things as they are, without being defeatist, while still being motivated to make things happen. They help us better able to endure things when they don't happen the way that we plan. So for a variety of reasons, I've been involved with the Stoic thought for about 40 years or so now. And I will say, too, from the start, the Stoics talk about all kinds of things. They have their own theology. Some modern Stoics are atheists, some are Christians, some are Buddhists, some are Hindus, So, but the ancient Stoics themselves are based purely on reason. They're purely on natural law and natural power of reason. So they kind of grappled with the concept of God, and some of them had very, very different views there. Overall, they tended to be more pantheistic, of seeing God, like as the universe itself, or nature itself, not necessarily separated and transcendent of it. But most of them do in some way reference God, and for some of them, their key concept is to follow God, to try to discern God's will through reason, and then follow that, live in a way that's in accordance with nature, in accordance with providence. So I'll stop here for now, but just say that I found the Stoics really profound, but primarily now in terms of their understanding of human psychology and our quest for tranquility and happiness and living virtuous lives.
Yes. Yeah, that's really interesting. I would like to explore that a little bit later, maybe the theological aspects, because you're right. There's a lot of sort of modern Stoicism that's become, I guess, popular among even modern atheists. And I get it. There's always insights you can get from previous systems that I think you can legitimately borrow or adapt without taking the system as a whole. But that has always seemed like one that you can't legitimately really do, right? I mean, even Marcus Aurelius talks about everything is either providence or atoms, yet we should abandon ourselves to God. So he clearly thinks it's providence, and that a lot of these Stoic principles kind of might only make sense in light of providential guidance rather than sort of atoms just sort of clapping about in the void. But I guess maybe you could just really just set all the metaphysical stuff aside and just be like, you know what, these principles seem to work on a practical day-to-day, so I'm just going to use them and not think about the bigger questions. I guess people, and that actually seems to me, I'd be curious to get your thoughts, if that seems to me to be how so much of the sort of modern sort of pop stoicism is. You see it, I don't know how much you keep up with this, you see it of really kind of, I think, along in circles of like tech entrepreneurship, right? A lot of these like big tech entrepreneurs are like super into stoicism, as just, sort of a practical self-help. Here's how I maintain my sanity type of system. What are your thoughts on that? Why do you think that's the case? And do you agree with the previous thing that I just said as well?
Yes, I do. And it's interesting that you say these tech people, because in a sense, the principles of Stoicism are a techne, are a skill, are an art. And where the current technology people are focusing on computers for the most part, the Stoics were focusing on the perfection of the human mind, our capacity to reason and control our emotions. So there is a lot of popular interest in Stoicism. The problem is sometimes it can become very superficial. I don't follow this pop version in the business world very closely. I'm somewhat aware of it, but I guess you wouldn't want to say that you follow these Stoic principles as your way of getting rich, and amassing a fortune and becoming well known throughout the world. If you adopt similar principles, possibly you'd be less disturbed by things. You could focus more on your projects. But the fundamental lesson of the Stoics is it's not these worldly criteria that really determine what a good person is or what success in life is. It is living that life of virtue, living what a human person is intended to be. And again, so their theology is kind of varied and all over the place. But in several places, some of the prominent Stoics, like mostly Seneca and Epictetus, really do speak in personal terms about God, sounding very much like our Christian concept of describing God as a father, describing, Seneca talks about the Holy Spirit. There's a Holy Spirit dwelling within us. The Epictetus talks about, God knowing our thoughts, knowing what we do. And in a really poignant phrase, Epictetus says, just to paraphrase him, he said, he said, my job is what am I, a lame old man, to do but sing praises to God? He goes, if I was a nightingale, well, I'd sing like a nightingale. If I was a swan, I'd sing it like a swan. He goes, but as it is, I'm a rational human being. So I'm going to use my rational mind to sing praises to God in my own way. And I hope that you'll join me in this song. So some really, really beautiful stuff there. But it is interesting. Some of the modern people, it's very, very pick and choose what you're going to pull from the Stoics and what you're going to leave aside. And I'd say, if I just had to estimate for myself, in terms of the psychological and ethical principles, I'm probably pulling a good 90% or more from the Stoics. I'm just, leaving behind a few issues on their understanding of theology, because I'm a Catholic and Christian and a Thomist who believes that, we can know some definite things about God based on reason alone, using a more precise reasoning than the Stoics themselves used in terms of God. And of course, I also subscribe to revelation, that God himself, Jesus Christ, came to earth. Now, the Stoics themselves, these prominent ones, were around during the early times of Christianity, during the life of Christ. But Epictetus, Musonius Rufus, Seneca, Marcus Aurelius, they don't really talk in any great depth about Christ or Christians, just a brief line here and there. So it doesn't appear they really knew Christ. The Gospels hadn't been assembled yet. The Bible hadn't been put together yet. So the Stoics' own knowledge of Christ was extremely minimal. So this was interesting to think, what these Stoics would have thought had they had access to the Bible, to later Christian thought.
Yeah, really interesting. And something that I know is the case, it sounds like this might have even been the case for you, is how much of a bridge Stoicism is for people sort of, either from a completely secular or atheistic worldview to a Christian worldview. It really does sort of mediate that conversion for a lot of people, which is fascinating, but also makes sense, because in Stoicism you see people trying to think very deeply about God's existence and the nature of God, but also importantly, human nature, virtue ethics, natural law. You really, if you want to understand natural law, the seeds of natural law are really right there in Stoicism, which of course is sort of picked up and baptized, if you will, by the church and more, articulated and refined. So it makes sense, right? If you find stuff in Stoicism attractive, it would make sense that would probably cause you to find a lot of the Christian intellectual tradition attractive. And maybe even if you feel like Stoicism gives you a lot of attractive stuff, but you'd like to go deeper, you'll probably find the deeper refinements in the Christian intellectual tradition as well. Because as you say, we're just sort of limited with the Stoic texts. And I think some of the stuff we know about Stoics come from non-Stoics as well, like Cicero, for example. He seems to be a source of how we know about Stoicism, but I don't think he himself was a Stoic. Is that right? Mm-hmm.
Yes. And there's different debates. Some people call him a Neoplatonist. He wrote his book on duties. He was really influenced by a particular Stoic of that time, but he didn't call himself a Stoic. I know Ryan Holiday in a co-author's recent book on the lives of the Stoic, they call him a fellow traveler of the Stoics, like a person who understood a lot of their thought, embraced some of it, probably wouldn't call himself a full-fledged Stoic, but was a great promoter of their cause in a way, because what he wrote about them gives us a deeper understanding. And I do agree with you. I mean, I enjoy Cicero's his own writings and his own perspectives as well. But that's one thing I do like about Stoics, writing as a Catholic, writing as a Thomist, a follower of St. Thomas Aquinas. I do see it as a bridge. There are so many atheists. There's people who follow other world religions who admire the Stoics. And there's so much there that is consonant with Christian thought that I think it can form that bridge. If you're a person who wants to maybe misinterpret a certain phrase of St. Paul talking about vain philosophy and think that all philosophy is vain, all philosophy is useless to a Christian, then you're going to have a hard time bridging the gap to people who say, well, I don't believe in the Bible. I'm going to use my mind. Well, the Stoics are one way, using that natural reason, where we can get people's mind engaged and then show them how what you determine through your reason is so consonant with what you're going to find in Revelation, and how Revelation even takes it higher. So I will say, during those 25 years, I consider myself an atheist. I still read the Stoics, and I read people like Albert Ellis, the psychologist I mentioned. Now, Ellis was an atheist. Well, actually, he said he's an agnostic, since he couldn't say for sure there wasn't a God, but he said he was 99.9999999% sure. So he's an agnostic who was darn close to an atheist.
Right. He's way over on that end of the spectrum.
Yeah,
right?
That's how he put himself. And then also a person who I read and admired, Aristotle, and still do to this day. And in the atheist I read, who patterned a lot of her work after Aristotle, was Ayn Rand, the great novelist and philosopher, the Russian American. She claimed that her philosophy was like an outgrowth of Aristotle's. But Rand was an atheist, but Aristotle himself, his own reason led him to a version of God, this prime mover. His own reason, he was not, an atheist. He wasn't a Christian. He lived 300 and some years before Christ. But it occurred to me when I came across St. Thomas Aquinas too, and I see, okay, here's a man, he didn't just give lip service to Aristotle. He wrote commentaries on every single line of many of his most profound books. He knew him left and right. He cites them thousands of times in the Summa Theologica. And he also knew the Stoics. He's citing Seneca, But anyway, while the modern people like Ellis and Rand, building on the Stoics and Aristotle, and they were atheists, the Stoics and Aristotle themselves were not out and out atheists. And the person who I found who best integrated all this, Stoicism, Aristotelianism, and the Christian faith, was St. Thomas Aquinas. So to me, that's my ultimate aha.
Yeah.
Here's the ultimate integration. But Stoicism made a very nice and important part that I still find worthwhile, going back to and imbuing.
Yeah, really cool. Okay, so we actually started more on the theological aspects, but let's circle back around now, and let's try and get some clarity on what Stoicism is itself. So how would you begin to sort of define Stoicism? What are its crucial characteristics as a school of philosophy? What sets it apart from other schools of philosophy? And then maybe we could start to talk about some of the important thinkers, if you don't mind.
Sure. And the term itself, Stoicism, comes from a particular place, the ancient Greek painted porch, the Stoa Poikile, where it's the founder, Zeno, first taught in the 3rd century BC. So that's kind of where the name comes. It just means this porch that they spoke from. But some of the fundamental ideas there we're told like the Epicureans, another philosophical school, they sought to maximize pleasure and to avoid pain.
Mhm.
And they're often kind of caricatured as these are the people who are eating the big legs of lamb and all, like maybe King Henry VIII did later on. But they're really more focused on more higher pleasures, more intellectual pleasures. But even there, the Stoics, by contrast, focus primarily on living a life of virtue. And in their most extreme forms, they really said, if you do what's right, if you try to, and some said, if you try to conform your will to God's, if you develop your ability to be a just person, to be practically wise, to be courageous, to have self-control, then that is going to be the key to fulfilling yourself as a human being, to have what Zeno called a good flow of life, to achieve the eudaimonia or more complete happiness and joy. So it's about living a life of virtue. That was the main thing. Now, pleasures will often flow along with it. And there's things that we can still pursue besides virtue, but they were called indifference. They're not essential. You might still want these things. You want nice things. You want good things for your family. So, but the fundamental there is virtue, though. Doing the right thing, being the right person, even if bad things happen to you, or even if you aren't able to acquire wealthy material goods. So that was one of their fundamentals, to focus on a life of virtue. But one of the fundamentals that the modern psychologists picked up on, and it was the first thing to hit me, was they teach so much how we have the capacity to a large extent, much more than most of us realize, to control our own emotions and behaviors. And speaking as a psychologist, to put this very, very briefly, through the 20th century, the two main schools influencing psychology and psychiatry were, well, psychoanalysis in psychiatry and clinical psychology, going back to Sigmund Freud. And, one of the fundamental ideas was that what's so important in our behavior and our disturbance, whether or not we have mental illness when we're adults, is what happens to us when we're young children. So they're doing this psychoanalysis, trying to get you to go back. What do you think about your mother and your father and so forth? So this view that what's important to us is what happened when we were little kids. The other in psychology was behaviorism, pulling from things like Ivan Pavlov and his experiments with the salivating dogs, and then B.F. Skinner and his experiments with the pigeons, rewarding or punishing them to get them to do all kinds of crazy things, depending on whether they got their food or not. But anyway, you can kind of fundamentally boil down both of these views to the idea that if we're disturbed, it's because of things, because of outside events, some trauma that happened as a child, or the way we are rewarded or punished for different kinds of behaviors as we grew up. Okay. Now, here's the fundamental Stoic insight to counter that. It comes from the 5th little chapter of Epictetus's handbook. And it says, basically, he says, people are disturbed not by things, but by the views they take of things. And that views word is sometimes judgments or beliefs. Other words are sometimes used there. But the fundamental idea then, people like Ellis said that maybe something did happen when you were a child that traumatized you. He said, but if you're an adult now, and that's disturbing you and impacting your life in a negative way today, he said, it's because what you're telling yourself today about that event in the past. So basically saying, or if you were rewarded or punished for certain things, and you say, that's why I am the way I am, they would say, yes, but it's also the way you are thinking about the rewards and punishments in the past. So he said, the main thing is if you change your perception, if you change the view you take of things, you may find that you can control your emotions and behaviors in a way you never experienced. So in other words, they're saying you're not at the mercy of outside stimuli that determine your responses. In between a stimulus and a response is your interpretation, your take on it. The same event that might devastate one person, another person might shrug their shoulders and say, hey, that's the way it is. Mm-hmm. So one of the fundamental kernels of Stoicism is to train yourself not to be disturbed by outward things, to remember your own power, to control your reactions to things, to try to keep living virtuously, even if you might be really angry. So they teach you how to curb your anger. It'll teach you how to be courageous and do things even though maybe you're fearful or anxious. It'll teach you how to get up and do your job in the morning. Like even Marcus Aurelius said this to himself. I got to get up out of the bed in the morning and do my job. Now, his job was the emperor of Rome. Most of us don't have a job like that. But
a little bit of pressure, right? Mm-hmm.
A little bit of pressure. But that's the fundamental concept of the Stoics. They're going to train us to realize we have capacities that we may not realize to control the way we act and behave. And they say what also flows from that. They said beginners in philosophy blame other people for their problems. People making some progress blame themselves. He said, but those who are truly mastering philosophy blame nobody. So it's not an issue of blame, it's an issue of doing the right thing. And the Stoics can help us learn to do that.
Yeah, I think this is what a lot of people in our culture today, they find these aspects of Stoicism very attractive. The aspect of taking responsibility, right? But also this aspect of control, where it's, I guess one of the fundamental themes of Stoicism is getting clarity on the things that we can control and the things we can't control, right? And we get clarity there first, and then we learn to focus on those things that we can control and to try and not be bothered or perceive poorly those things that we cannot control. And that seems like just absolutely fundamentally good advice. I mean, what else are you going to do at the end of the day, right?
Yeah,
we don't really have many other options, right? So you might as well take this advice on board. But I want to say, do the Stoics talk about, because I think most of us would say, in modern society, that seems really good advice. There's probably just a ton of stuff that we let bother us, that really it bothers us because we cause it to bother us, right? We ruminate on it. We conceptualize it in all sorts of negative ways that we don't need to see it that way. But and I think Aristotle hints at this, there's clearly like limit cases, right? Like if you're covered in boils or you're being boiled in hot water for 10,000 years nonstop, right? Like how much are these Stoic principles going to help you in that? And I think that's probably why Aristotle said, and a little, some good health and maybe a little bit of money can help too, right? So where do you think the right appropriate balance is there? And that is it something that you think Stoicism is committed to, that like extreme, right? Like it's absolutely everything is about trying to get the right conceptualization, or just a lot of things. But granted, there's some things that could just make you miserable, full stop, because they're just so wretched. You see what I'm saying?
Yes, and I agree with that second part. The Stoics, maybe certain writings will give that impression, and often they're caricatured, that way. Though you can be happy if you're sitting there being boiled alive or something, whistling away, like that one Monty Python movie. Always look on the bright side of life. Maybe.
yeah. You're just looking at this the wrong way.
That's right. That would be extreme. And interestingly, there too, there's the place in the Summa Theologica where St. Thomas Aquinas is talking about the passion of anger. And Seneca wrote a whole book on it, De Ira, about ire or anger. And, Aristotle said that, yes, we can be angry, but we need to be angry for the right reasons, at the right person, at the right time, for the right purpose, like to correct them or right some wrong rather than just to destroy them, And often the Stoics are portrayed as saying you should never be angry at all. And Thomas digs into this, comparing Seneca and Aristotle, and says, I think this is really more a matter of semantics, the terminology they're using, because he thinks fundamentally they're basically in agreement there. Like certain things, like you're talking about borderline, this or that. Seneca does say that in a way, and he's kind of aware of some of the modern psychological ideas that like certain reactions we have to stimuli are kind of stimulated by the lower brain centers, or like reflexive, like somebody comes and just steps on your toe. Ow, it's going to hurt. And, and if you think they did it on purpose, you might instantly get a sense of anger. Or Seneca even talks about if you have a tendency to blush when you have to speak in public, which used to be real bad for me. He said, some of these things are going to go on even in a Stoic. Or they said there's an old story that a Stoic was out on the sea on a ship and a big storm blew up and a big bolt of thunder and lightning came, and they saw the old Stoic shivering. They're like, look at this. The Stoic, is afraid. And Seneca's saying, well, Stoicism, it doesn't erase our nature. We still are human beings. We still do have these reactions, but with practice, it may help us temper them, rein them in somewhat. So I try to avoid the extreme takes of Stoicism. So the way I look at Stoicism, I interpret it as just almost imperceptible difference in the way that Aristotle describes the approach to thought and emotion. And I think they both really hit the core of natural reason and common sense, and maybe just fine-tuned language that distinguishes them in that. But I do find them both extremely practically helpful if you don't expect, miracles, if you don't expect that. Well, the Stoics talk a lot about the sage. This is a person who would be influenced by almost nothing, never perturbed. But then they also have a history saying, well, is there anybody who really is a sage? Well, they say maybe the closest examples we can think of are people like Socrates or the cynic Diogenes, or some of the Romans would say Cato, the ancient Roman Cato. But the really point they're saying is it's kind of a goal. We can strive for this total mastery over self, we're probably never actually going to attain that in this life. But even the striving, moving along that way, can help us be better people, can help us live better lives.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you. That is a very helpful and important clarification, because sometimes I'll see people sort of, I guess, dismiss Stoicism based on that really kind of caricature, and like that's not really what they're saying. And let's just be honest, most of us, the stresses that we're under are at least minimally exacerbated by how we react to them, right? And the Stoics are really, really helpful there. So let's talk about now, Dr. Vost, if you don't mind, about the good life according to the Stoics, because they are all about there being an objective human nature, and that there are certain perfections that we can achieve to have this life of flourishing. So how did the Stoics think about the virtues, and how do they recommend that we go about acquiring some of those, if you don't mind?
Yes. And, some of the Stoics took a little bit different approaches. They're consistent, they're constant, but they had different emphases. Like, for example, Musonius Rufus from the 1st century AD was Epictetus's teacher. And we have some fragments of his writing that came from later sources, or actually they're from his lectures. Now, we don't actually have his writings. And he was one of the Stoics that talked about the 4 classical cardinal virtues that we also find in Scripture. The Old Testament references these, that, in our modern language today we would call self-control or temperance, courage or fortitude, justice, and prudence or practical wisdom. So these are the 4 things, so with your self-control, you're going to rein in your passions, like your lusts, your desires. Okay, I'm going to know how to limit myself. For courage or fortitude, you're going to rile yourself up to do difficult things, to do hard things, to face and endure.
So we have diet and exercise, right?
That's exactly right. No, that is exactly right. When you look at some of these fundamental virtues, they apply to almost everything in our life. And Aristotle and Thomas said that the virtues are to the soul like health and beauty and fitness are to the body. So that is right. And then, of course, justice is giving each person their rightful due, that sense of fairness. Prudence or practical wisdom being knowing the right ways to live a virtuous life. So we don't have lofty goals and then do silly things to get them that end up actually causing more trouble than they're worth. But I will say too, so Musonius Rufus tends to talk about the 4 cardinal virtues the most. He also points out, and this is in the 1st century AD, he also points out women need these exactly as men do. They have their own maybe possible differences in duties and lives. They may express these differently, but he said women should be educated in philosophy just like men. They are completely as capable of virtue as men are. So I really admire that in Rufus. Now, Epictetus, he talks most about something that I kind of call like virtue with a capital V, but it's kind of like with a capital P for prohoresis, which means our power, our own power to make choices. And it's been translated in English a ton of different ways, like will, moral purpose is one that I like. But this idea that we have the capacity to make rational choices. And that capacity then shows itself out in all kinds of different virtues. Through that capital P prohoresis, now I need to bring in justice to this situation dealing with another person. Now I need to call forth my temperance and control myself so I don't eat too many donuts. I've had 3 already. I think 4 might be a bit much today, or whatever the case might be there. And then finally, Seneca talks about a great variety of virtues in a way that he kind of anticipates the great medieval theologians like Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas. He talks about a variety of virtues, writes complete books on some, like De Beneficiis on benefits or on gratitude. He writes a book on that, how the proper way to express gratitude and not to show ingratitude, or clemency, how when we are going to administer punishment to a person, how we're going to do that in a humane way. He writes an essay on that, and patience, just a variety of things there. So there's a lot of nice approaches to the Stoics. They have their different twists, but they all kind of fit together in a nice way. And for the most part, the way they describe their virtues, there's going to be very little there that would that a Christian couldn't nod in agreement with. Though there are a few Stoic ideas that Christians would not embrace. I should make that known too. And one of those is some of them embrace the idea of the justifiable suicide in certain circumstances.
Yeah, right. And it's the same thing with obviously Aristotle and Plato. A lot in common, but a few things we definitely would say, nope, drawing the line there, right?
Right. No, exactly. And something that, St. Thomas Aquinas is famous for is he's searching for truth wherever it can be found. He said, don't remember necessarily who said what, but remember what they said, if it was true. Now, Thomas himself, he remembers both. He always tells us where it came from. But Seneca is very similar to that too. He said he's searching out truths, and often he'll quote the Epicureans when they get that part right. So I think today in our own world, we can do that with the Stoics. We need to go in there and we need to separate the wheat from the chaff. For almost anything that we read outside of, defined dogmas of the faith, we're going to need to use our own critical thinking there and say, that makes sense to me or that doesn't. So the Stoicide is one area where I disagree with the Stoics. And in a way, it's ironic too, that these are the people who say I can endure anything. And that they're the people who are saying, remember, the door is always open for your way out.
Yeah, very inconsistent. And even Seneca himself seemed to have some kind of mixed feelings on it, didn't he? Because he's got at least 2 letters where he talks about suicide. You have to remind me there. I haven't memorized all the Stoics. That's why I need your book.
Yes, he does bring it up in certain occasions, and he talks about it praiseworthy in certain extreme contexts. Like he talks about a young, late teen or young man who's been captured as a slave. And he's going to be put in the gladiatorial arena or something. And he's on this cart, big wooden cart. They're taking him to the arena. So he decides instead he's going to work his head in between the spokes and kill himself. So Seneca considered that a noble thing, that he was killing himself as opposed to allowing himself to be used in gladiatorial games. So, it's fine-tuned stuff. The Stoics are not people saying, hey, go out there and commit suicide. Now, Epictetus didn't. Musonius Rufus didn't. Most of them didn't. Now, Seneca himself did, but it was upon the order of Nero.
Right.
It was kill yourself or my guys are coming for you.
Right.
But yeah, so that's kind of an interesting and odd aside there with the Stoics where I disagree, but I see that the reason behind what they were saying, even though I disagree with them, I don't think they're the greatest of reasons. But again, it's nothing fundamental to Stoicism in my view.
Yeah, and I think this is obviously important, as always, right? No matter how you're looking back at something from a particular paradigm or lens, both of us would be looking at it from a Catholic Christian lens. But even if you're looking at it through a different lens, it's always important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right? You read Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, you might disagree with some of his particular applications here and there, but that doesn't mean he doesn't have a good system on his hands. It just means maybe at some points he was sort of inconsistent with his own system.
Oh, exactly. Like two of the great medievals who were known for following Aristotle. In fact, Francis Bacon, a philosopher, used to make jokes about how the medievals were so wedded in Aristotle that they didn't open up their eyes. Like he tells a story of all these religious people debating how many teeth were in the mouth of a horse. And someone's going through Aristotle, someone else is going through the Bible, and he says after several days, they said, this is an unsolvable mystery. Aristotle and the great church fathers, Augustine, nobody told us. And they said some young friar says, hey, there's a horse out in the barn. You want me to go out there and open its mouth and count it? And the way the story goes in Bacon is, they smote him hip and thigh and said, get the heck out of here. This is an unsolvable mystery, But it's a caricature. St. Albert the Great and Thomas Aquinas are two of the people who followed Aristotle most closely. But even Albert the Great wrote a little treatise on the errors of Aristotle.
Right. Yeah. They were not afraid to correct the philosopher.
Oh, that's right. No, they had great respect for him, but they knew he was a man. And like all men, he makes mistakes. And in terms of scientific issues, they had almost no instruments back then. A lot of what Aristotle is learning is coming from hearsay. So no, like them, we can go back to these ancient peoples who had a lot of good ideas and say, hey, I like that good idea. I want to incorporate that somehow. We can also say, boy, they were off the mark here. So scratch that one.
So let's talk about, I guess, maybe call them the big three Stoic philosophers, Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Do you think these are the three that people should start with? And if so, how would you recommend people get started if they want to start studying and learning about Stoicism?
Sure. Yes. I would say these are three of the later Stoics that we have the most complete works. Like I was going to say writings, but Epictetus's are not his own writings. They're recordings of lectures or even Q&A sessions from one of his students. But yeah, I'd say those are the fundamental three. They're the later three. Also, though they sometimes they tap into a bit of their theology, they tap a bit into their ideas of science, and other branches of philosophy, metaphysics, logic, and so forth. These writings that we have are primarily their psychology and their virtue ethics. So they're primarily the practical stuff. Primarily, I would say probably the useful stuff. They're talking about human emotions, human situations, human interactions that existed 2,000 years ago and still exist today. So it is. So a person who wanted to learn. Now, Epictetus is a very interesting character himself. They say his name means acquired in Greek. So he was a slave boy who was later set free. So he was a very humble man. He called himself a lame old man. One story is that one time one of his owners was twisting his leg, and Epictetus said, hey, if you keep twisting my leg, it's going to break, and then twist it and pop. And there's Epictetus said, well, see, I told you so. But we don't know for sure. The other people think it might have been a disease, but he was lame later in life. He was somewhat physically limited by one leg. He was a slave. He later just became a teacher, a professional philosopher, a teacher. But he's just a grand person. And a person who wanted to start with him, there's a little thing called the Enchiridion, or the Handbook. And it's just maybe 25, 30 pages in a modern translation. And there's all kinds of translations out there. They're really easy and inexpensive. But that's where he gives all this really practical stuff. Like you mentioned earlier, the fundamental Stoic concept, what's under our control and what's not under our control. If I remember right, the first sentence in that book is some things are under our control.
That's right. It comes right from the Enchiridion.
And creating the very first little paragraph there. So that's a really good one. But it's really kind of, in my book, Memorize the Stoics, I go through it. I summarize each of those and try to get the fundamental lessons. So they're really fundamental lessons. They're good lessons. They were so important even that medieval monks, there were 3 Christianized versions of this handbook where people thought, hey, this would be helpful for monks to have in monasteries. So they kind of adapted it to Christian readers. But anyway, good lessons in his handbook. They pull from longer books a person could go to next called the Discourses. And this is like 2 major modern books full of nice long essays. And the cool thing about the Discourses is that's where you get to meet Epictetus himself. And he was really a blunt, colorful, I find very humorous and humane guy. So the Discourses of Epictetus are really good reading. Seneca wrote a bunch of moral essays. He wrote about anger. He wrote about clemency. He wrote about benefits or gratitude and the shortness of life and the good life, things like this. He also wrote these magnificent 124 letters to his friend Lucilius that are just full of insights. And in my latest book, Memorize the Stoics, I summarize the first 50 of those and give us techniques for how we can remember at least one key idea from each of those. So those, to me, are really nice. I really love them because in my mind, Seneca is like as polished and elegant as Epictetus is as gruff and straightforward and in your face, because Seneca was a polished man. He was in the equestrian class, the knight class right before the senators. Originally came from what's now Spain, but he worked his way up to where he was a senator and actually the tutor to Nero. Him and along with a military man named Burrus kind of guided young Nero during his first 5 years where things actually overall went pretty well. Yeah,
what happened?
And then Nero kind of had ideas on his own and got rid of Seneca. And yeah, Nero, I mean, he was the matricide, killed his mother. Later tells his old mentor Seneca he has to kill himself. So things really went off the rails there. But part of the intriguing story with Seneca is too that some people think he's a big hypocrite. He's a rich guy telling us how we can be happy if we're poor, things like that. But there's another side to him. A lot of his philosophical writing came later in life, and we do know that later in his life he tried to disengage himself from the court, from Nero, from Rome, moved out to the suburbs. He just wanted to live his life. He wanted to give back a lot of the money that Nero had given him, and Nero wouldn't take it. So Seneca, in a way, I see him as a person who was very strongly possessed with worldly ambitions and desires as a young man. I think he really did embrace Stoicism more and more the older he got. Maybe as he saw the trap he had built for himself. So then he tried to disentangle himself and was ordered to commit suicide before he hit age 70. But just a fascinating character. Then the last, Marcus Aurelius. Now we go to an actual emperor himself. I think his reign was like 169 AD to 180. And like when Gibbon wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, he talked about like this happy age of the 5 good emperors, and Aurelius was the last of them before things started going downhill. And if anybody's seen the modern movie Gladiator,
yeah, he gets snuffed out.
Yeah, in that movie he gets snuffed out by his son Commodus.
Right.
And I'm not sure if that's accurate or not, but his son Commodus did become the next emperor, and he wasn't a good one.
Right.
But Aurelius himself was a very noble character in many ways, because Plato always wrote about the philosopher king. A philosopher ideally would rule, so he would rule with justice and stuff. And in a sense, Aurelius was one of those. So, I mean, he wasn't perfect, but a lot of good things happened during Rome. But when he was off defending the borders of the empire in the Germanic areas, he would write to himself these Stoic lessons that he'd learned from Epictetus foremost and from others that are called the Meditations. And it's a nice, decent-sized modern book in a modern translation. And they're full of noble insights. He's much more somber. He thinks a lot more about death, about like looking back on time. He says, before me there were the emperors Vespasian and Trajan and Hadrian, and now they're all gone. And most of the people who even lived in their time, they're all gone too. And before I know it, that's going to apply to me and everybody I know today. So to read Aurelius is to get you to realize too the shortness of life and the value of life. So you try to make the most of it during your limited time here on earth. So those are the big three: Epictetus, Seneca, and Marcus Aurelius. Yeah,
excellent. Really helpful. So I want to, for our last couple minutes here, and I want to turn to your excellent new book that is out, and it's got an endorsement on the back cover by somebody named Pat Flynn. So
I've heard of him.
We know it's got to be good. And I love your books because your books have you have many different books, but you have this line of books where you use this really cool memory system to help people just memorize different things. You've got one on memorizing the faith, memorizing the Latin Mass, and now you have Memorize the Stoics. I want you to talk about this because it's really cool, it's really unique, and it can help people just build a unique skill in and of itself, which is improve their memory, but then apply it to certain areas that might interest them, including Stoic thought. So tell us a little bit about this memory system and then how you use it in this book.
Sure. And here I'll go back to a common character we've already brought up, Cicero, right? Cicero is one of our better sources outside the Stoic school of what the Stoics were all about. And Cicero lived before those big three. So he's giving us some of the more ancient, original Stoic ideas. So he's a really valuable person there. But he also is one of the greatest people who passed on what they call this ancient art of memory. It was first attributed to Simonides, an ancient Greek, and it involved using visual images and orderly arrangements of things. People may be aware of this, like they call it the memory palace.
I remember it being called the Peg and Link system when I first learned about it.
There's Peg and Link system where you're tying these things together. You're forming striking visual images of whatever you want to remember, and you're tying them together in some way. Some of the earliest books used like an architectural arrangement. You're going through like the rooms of a house or a building or different areas within a room, and that's the one that I use. So interestingly, Cicero provided us information about the Stoics and also about this ancient memory method. And then later, part of the reason I got into it so much was my specialty area in psychology was memory. My master's thesis was about memory strategy, use for adolescents. My doctoral work was at an Alzheimer's center. I worked with some brain damage patients, showing them how these memory methods work. But anyway, so I incorporate that into the book. So the book is like, it's a guided tutorial. It is illustrated. I use these memory rooms that are simple. The first ones are as simple as just rooms from a house. In fact, I painted them after my own house. You start with a little entranceway or foyer, and you memorize these 10 little locations, like just a front door, an entrance mat, a picture up on the wall, things like that.
Just to give a little preview for those watching. You can see.
Yeah, there's the foyer. Yeah, there's the foyer, and they're all numbered. So for example, I'll just give one example to get this started here.
Oh, please, yeah.
But you imagine you come to the front door. This is my house. The door opens, and you're kind of shocked because when the door opens, you see like a jet fighter's cockpit in there, and it has these 2 control panels. So you form this image. I got this control panel, and you work your way through different crazy images for each part of the foyer there, right? But then I explain what they all mean. Well, what did we just say was the first message in the first chapter of Epictetus' handbook? Some things are under our control. Some things are not under our control. So there's our 2 control panels. There's also a little bit of modern Stoic history there, because one of the famous modern people who embraced Stoicism was a man named James Bond Stockdale, who was a pilot who was shot down during the war in Vietnam, spent almost 8 years as a prisoner of war, And he said he used his knowledge of Epictetus to keep his sanity during that time. So, but anyway, for each of these, you'll form this visual image, and it might seem silly or outlandish at first, but later I'll say how this ties into an actual concept.
Would you say is it better the more outlandish it is, because that way it kind of sticks in your mind more? Like
yes, it is.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Often you do want to make these images kind of crazy. They're unusual or strange in one way or another, because, and Thomas Aquinas talks about this. He says, when we're awake every day, we see a zillion different things come in through our senses. He said, so what we tend to remember are the things that are most odd and unusual. So when something really weird happens, and we're more likely to remember. So you try that when you build these little memory things, for example, and some of them operate on puns too, on verbal puns. Like I'm thinking, okay, the 9th chapter, Epictetus talks about his concept of prohairesis, right? So, how am I going to turn that into a visual image? So I'm thinking, okay, prohairesis. So I say, okay, imagine this. You see Yoda of Star Wars fame sitting on this little cushioned bench, which was the 9th location. Sitting next to him is a very hairy athlete, professional athlete. So Yoda says, pro-hairy he is. So there's our prohairesis.
Right, yeah. Very silly, but also that's going to be hard to forget, right?
Yeah, and then of course, then later when I give the commentary on each, I explain, okay, what exactly is this prohairesis that Yoda's talking about? So basically, you work that your way all through. I do all 53 chapters of Epictetus's handbook that way by going through 10 spots in a foyer, 10 spots in a living room, and there's an illustration. Oh, the illustrations are by my daughter-in-law, actually, which makes it a little bit extra special. There's a dining room. Then you come into a study where I'm sitting right now. It's patterned after my own little study that gives us locations, 31 to 40. And then the last ones, I use a porch. I said, well, I'm not going to use like an imagined porch on my house. I'm going to use the porch. So we have an illustration of that stoa poikile, that painted porch, which my daughter-in-law just did, a simplified, stylized example, but that itself then becomes your mnemonic system. We have like a bust of Zeno in there, who was the founder. The last one is Epictetus himself is standing there teaching in the center. That's our last one there. So we just kind of try to make it fun. We go through this system of images, locations, but once you learn these locations, they become like a template. They become like a notepad in your head, and you can reuse them again and again for different information. So like in the second part of the book, now we move to Seneca. And I use the same locations again, but now we're putting new information in each one. Now at the front door, you open the front door and this huge book flies right past you. Or no, a huge clock flies right past your face. Well, one of his first messages is how time flies, how we need to grasp every hour, So now we have a whole new set of images for each of these locations, because now we're tying them in to Seneca. And with practice, you learn, which ones come with which one. And then finally for Marcus Aurelius, there's that picture. There's this famous statue of Marcus Aurelius on a horse. And my daughter-in-law drew an image of that. And for the lessons on Aurelius, we actually use that image itself is our location system. So like the flank of the horse is number 1. Marcus's heart is another one of the numbers, and so on. You kind of work your way around the horse and Marcus, and you memorize his own key concepts on those places on that statue.
Yeah, really cool. And what an awesome skill in general, and all the better when we can apply it to studying philosophy. Love it. So Dr. Vost, where can people get a copy of your wonderful new book? Because I obviously want to encourage them to do so.
Well, I appreciate that. It is published by Angelico Press. So they have their own website, angelico.com or angelicopress.com, but they'll guide you to like Amazon, I believe, and Barnes & Noble are probably the two main providers. So other sources may have it out there.
Great. I will be sure to link that in the show notes. Before we go, do you mind if we take a question or two from the audience?
Oh, yes, let's do that.
All right, here's one from Brendan. He says, are there any limits to your memory system? Can you still remember things over long periods of time, even after taking on many new subjects of study?
That is a fantastic question. I'm glad that was brought up. One of the things I give in the book that goes back to the ancients is that repetition is the mother of memory. Repetitio mater memoriae. That these methods, one of the things you need to do, well, you need the images, you need the locations, but you need to concentrate and you need to rehearse or repeat. So you go through this one time, you learn all these, maybe you can repeat them back. That's great. But if you just all of a sudden, a week or two later, you ask yourself, would you still have them? No, maybe not. to remember them thoroughly, you will have to occasionally go back and rehearse. Though each time you do, it's easier to do so because it's kind of muscle memory. It's memory. Once you've learned it, it becomes far, far easier to retrieve it later on. And depending on the nature of the material, the more time you put to lock it in, the more firmer it's going to be there. So for example, like now, if I give a live talk, I almost always do them just from memory with no notes. They might go an hour long. I might have 40 or 50 points I want to make. So I'll make those points through this memory system. I'm mentally going through this house while I'm giving my talk. So if I wanted to, I could give the talk backwards. I know what the conclusion is. It'd be kind of weird, I guess, but I could go back to the introduction, right? So the things that are more important, you spend more time on, and those you will recall. The things that aren't important will be gone. Well, I say too, like you could use these for your grocery list, and you could use them for a different list every time you go to the store, because who cares? You're not going to repeat your last week's grocery list. So it's going to be gone. But those locations, by using them again and again, those are going to be there. If you use these locations for different material, you're going to have those. But that specific material itself will fade over time. There's no doubt about it if you don't repeat it. So like for me, let's say I'm giving this talk, a certain talk from memory. First, I put those points down on paper. Then I put them all inside of my head. Maybe 4 years later, I'm giving the same talk. I haven't given it since then. Could I give that talk from memory that day? No. But if I sat down for 15 minutes and looked at those points again, could I get up and do it? Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it's kind of like strength training, right? Takes a little bit of time to kind of build up the strength. But once you have it, it's easier to maintain and certainly easier to regain afterwards once you've sort of built it up.
Exactly the same parallel.
Yeah, awesome. Excellent. So before we say goodbye, is there anything else that you are working on, Kevin? Any new projects coming down the pipeline? And also, where can people keep up with you, your website and all that good stuff? Mm-hmm.
Sure. Just the website's just drvost.com, drvost.com. It's not really up to date. My daughter-in-law may be updating it soon, but there's a comment box there. So if people want to contact me, they can do it. I'll respond to you. Other projects coming up. A lot of projects are on the burner right now because these last 2 crazy years of COVID, for some reason, these different projects really stockpiled. But I'll just tell you about 2 of them. 2 of them coming up this year. The one that's very, very philosophical is for Catholic Answers. It's called What is God? How St. Thomas Aquinas Answered His Own Burning Childhood Question. And this goes through the attributes of God in the first part of the Summa Theologica. And the other on the physical plane, which of course Pat is also so adept at, it will be called You Are That Temple, a practical guide to health and holiness, coming out from Sophia Press this summer. And that will go into nutrition, weight training, cardiovascular training, how exercise impacts the mind, the spiritual benefits of exercise, and includes 23 essays from different modern Catholics who integrate faith and fitness in intriguing ways. One of those guys is named Pat Flynn.
Yeah, he keeps popping up in this conversation. Sounds like quite the guy, right? Yeah.
People who are old enough may remember an old cartoon, Savoir Faire, and he said, Savoir Faire, he's everywhere. Well, Pat Flynn's the guy who's everywhere.
Well, thank you so much. And we're obviously going to have you back on to talk about both of those books once they're released or closer to release. And that's one thing I love about your work so much. You're an awesome generalist. You just have mastery in so many different areas, and you put out so much good, useful stuff. You have the deep philosophy, you have the practical fitness stuff. I love it, and I appreciate the work you're doing. And people haven't gotten any of your books yet. Now is the time. It's wonderful material. The newest being Memorize the Stoics from Angelico Press. So please treat yourself to a copy of that. You will not be disappointed. Dr. Vost, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
Hey, it's always my pleasure, Pat. Look forward to talking to you again soon.